Alrighty, we will get started here now. We want to welcome back Carol Grove, our flood zone expert, to join us in part two of her presentation. This session is being recorded and will be shared later with membership, and it is also live on Facebook. As per usual with these roundtables, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A section, and we will address those when we can. Carol, take it away.
All right, good. I guess it's good afternoon now. So happy to have everybody back, anybody who is back. For those of you who may not have been here a few days ago, as we said, this has been recorded, and I don't know if you've had a chance to go back and watch the recording from 2 days ago. We're trying to split this into 4 parts, so it's going to be a little choppy because right at the end of the last session, there were a flood of questions, or there seemed to be questions about what I would be answering in slides to come. So if you can kind of be patient, I realize if you did not see this first session that I taught, you may be missing some knowledge. So probably the number one thing, just to recap a little bit, that we did talk about was we have FEMA flood maps out there. At the very end, a week from today will be our 4th session. We're going to actually break out of the PowerPoint and show you how to look up properties on the FEMA flood maps. Now, everyone may know how to look them up, but I'm going to teach you how to look them up in a special spot that FEMA has that's extra good, because there's things we can see that other people don't realize. So that's to be, to come a week from today. But looking back at what we did talk about, the FEMA maps are extremely approximate. When a person is about to close on a property and they're about to purchase and the property has structures on it, that is when the property is forced by the lender to pay flood insurance. And in Michigan today, 85% of the people out there who are being forced to pay flood insurance are not truly in a flood zone. And just one more thing I want to point out again before I jump in is when we look at a flood map and we see all that blue, you still do not know where the flood zone is completely. You have no idea. And the only thing that dictates truly whether a structure is in a flood zone or not is going to be somebody like me, a surveyor, going out and shooting the elevation at the lowest point on that structure. Okay, so just because we see a flood map and we see blue doesn't mean that that's truly where the flood zone is. So where we left off on Tuesday is I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of flood maps, and in order to understand how we got to where we're at today, we do have to go back and talk historically about where all these flood maps came from. Okay, when we look at a flood map, as I said, that FIR that you see there, that's a flood insurance rate map is what it stands for. Those are not set in stone. We have been able to change flood zones here in Michigan again and again. And there are a lot of mistakes on these flood maps. For instance, every lake in Washtenaw County has the wrong elevation on it right now. FEMA has reported an incorrect elevation on their most current flood maps. Okay, so I know this, but most people do not know this. Okay, and in fact, even our state of Michigan DEQ people, I have to remind them that those numbers are not correct, and they're FEMA here in Michigan. So again, there are a lot of mistakes. We are going to mostly talk about throughout this whole presentation, all 4 times, is going to be about this thing called a LOMA, which is a letter of map amendment. That is what I do a whole lot of, okay? We literally specialize in LOMAs. What does a LOMA do? It takes a requirement for flood insurance away. If a lender is forcing it, we complete a LOMA, and there's no longer a requirement for people to pay flood insurance, okay? You also should know that when somebody pays flood insurance, they pay it on one structure at a time, okay? So if one example is I had a client up in the Thumb area of Michigan, and he had 9 outbuildings, okay? And I could get his main house out, I could get a couple of his garages out, but most of his barns and outbuildings, I was unable to get out. So he had to write a flood policy for each structure. Okay. So when I take things out of a flood zone, usually I'm taking one structure at a time. On one document, I can take 3, 4, 5, 6 structures out on one property. So I just wanted to point that out, that people are charged flood insurance on more than one structure at a time. Okay. Another thing I want to point out is there is this thing called letter of map revision with Phil. Okay. And what is a letter of map revision with Phil? Well, that is when we have, like, out around our lakes today, we have a lot of old cottages, for instance. And these cottages might be sitting kind of low because they were built many years ago. Well, maybe you've got a potential buyer that's shopping around for lakefront property, and he wants to buy this old house that's maybe a cottage. He wants to tear down the cottage and put a nice big foot home there. This happens quite often, right? And so if you have and again, this is just one example of a LOMRF I'm giving you. If you have a buyer that wants to buy that property, we might go out and check that cottage because it's in a flood zone right now. And when I check it, maybe the ground around that cottage is 6 inches too low and I can't take the ground out. Many times your buyer will walk away from that deal because they will think, well, I don't want to build a house in a flood zone. So, but what the one thing you need to understand is we have a way of lifting that ground out of a flood zone. We usually, 50% of the time, we have to petition our DEQ, which is now called EGLE. The other 50% of the time, there's this thing called non-jurisdictional. We don't even have to talk to EGLE. In that case, if it's non-jurisdictional, we just let the community know. So we would tear down the old house, we would raise the ground up, and we would build the new house completely out of a flood zone. So your buyer would never pay flood insurance. So it's really important to understand that those properties that are really low, that they're planning on tearing houses down, we can raise those up. So those properties are actually worth a lot more than we think they are. And again, if you guys have questions along the way, by all means, please step in and type in a quick question for us so that we know you're wondering about certain things that I'm talking about. Okay. Physical map revisions, those are really big areas of the map. As I said before, maps are very inaccurate if we have large developing areas. And even like there's up in Owasso is a good example. They called me because they have a bunch of historical buildings along the river in downtown Owasso. And because they're all in a flood zone, they're concerned. So they want to raise up the seawall and protect these old buildings. And what we would do is there's a process that we would go through, and we would raise up that seawall and protect these buildings, and we'd have to amend the map, a big strip of the map. So there's big areas of maps that we amend as opposed to just one building at a time. So in order to discuss what we're all going to be talking about in the next couple sessions, I kind of got to step back, and this today we're going to be talking a little bit about history. Okay, so historically, these few things and that you're going to be covering right now are all federal laws. Okay, so that you understand where we came from and how we got to where we're at today. So in 1968, this is a federal law that was passed, and again, it was at the national level. And so you would have never seen a flood map prior to 1968, because this is the law that gave the power to the federal government, to FEMA, to actually create flood maps. And the main reason we have flood maps, I pretty much blame the Mississippi River for that. For those of you who might have been alive back in the 60s, we had a bunch of incidents of very bad floods along the Mississippi, and houses kept getting washed away along the Mississippi River. So our federal government, because they have federally backed mortgages out there, and right now today about 85% of our mortgages out there are federally backed, they decided they needed to give people guidance to building. Okay, so they created these maps and they gave the power to FEMA to create the maps with this law that we're looking at right here, okay? And then in 1973, this is the act that basically, this is the law that gave a power to a lender to force it. So this law, in a nutshell, says the following. It says to the lenders, the homeowners are guilty, property owners are guilty till they prove themselves innocent, that they will incur the expense of proving themselves innocent, which means they're going to have to hire a surveyor, somebody like me, to prove that they're not truly in a flood zone. And then it also says a few other things. It actually tells the lenders that if anybody is in or near a flood zone, you must force flood insurance. Now, the near is that operative word there, because a lot of people will look at a flood map and they'll say, well, my structure is 20 feet from the flood zone. Remember, when we look at the maps, we really don't know where the flood zone line is because they're so approximate. So a lender truly is supposed to force flood insurance if you're anywhere near a flood zone line, okay? And so let me step back for 1 second and tell you about that whole lender forcing flood zone so you understand what's occurring. Anytime a lender in the United States today is going to loan money on a structure, or I'm sorry, a property that has a structure, they are required by federal law to run what's called a flood check. Okay, so a lender will walk over to their computer in their office, let's say 14 days before they're about to close a loan, and they'll walk over there and they'll type everything in and they'll say, here's the property information. They'll push a button and they'll send it off to La La Land, and it'll end up down in somebody's computer, maybe CoreLogic in Texas. Okay, that's a flood cert company. And so the lender sends off a request to a flood cert company. The flood cert company, in a matter of just minutes, the document comes back into the lender's office. It's populated in the lender's screen, and it says, yes, force flood insurance, or no, do not. What does that tell us? That tells us that the lender just sent off a request and some computer just made that decision for you. Okay, so we know that computers are making these decisions and they're wrong a lot of the times. Okay, so it's really important for us as realtors to protect our buyers and look these properties up before our buyers buy someone else's problem, because a computer is saying yes or no, not a person. So we need you as a realtor to help your buyers recognize when they're very close to a flood zone or actually into a flood zone. If they end up, the computer says, nope, you can go ahead and not force flood insurance, your buyer may buy somebody else's problem, okay? So this is the whole reason we're here today. We're talking about this. 1986, the federal government passed this other law, and this was to force communities to force people to build high enough, okay, like along the Mississippi River. They wanted those people to start building houses high enough so they wouldn't get washed out in the event of a flood. Same thing here in Michigan. There are areas in downtown Lansing that flooded a few years ago badly, okay? And there are areas along the rivers that snake through downtown Lansing that are in areas where the structures could wash away in the event of a flood. Okay, you're not supposed to build structures there, but there are areas like that. You need to protect your buyers. There are areas that you don't even know are flood zones. There's no water anywhere nearby. So again, 1986 law, that was for the communities to help property owners build proper when it comes to flood zones. These next two laws are basically the beginning of our new maps today. Okay, as we talked in our last session, I showed you a picture of the United States where all these communities have had new maps since 2006. We started getting new maps here in Michigan. 2004 was the final blessing on those maps, okay? The new maps were then blessed and validated. 2005, Katrina hit. Most people think Katrina's the reason we have these new maps, but that's not why. This all started way back in 94 with the new maps, okay? And then in 2006, of course, we got our very first new map here in Michigan. All right. And then there were these two laws, these two federal laws that came into play one in 2012, one in 2014. It's very important to understand that in 2012, that law was extremely strict, extremely restrictive, and it actually, when it kicked in, it scared the living daylights out of a whole bunch of property owners, okay? What it did was it drove the flood premiums up severely on properties in flood zones, okay? But the 2014 Act came back and it pulled half of the Biggert Waters Act back, okay? So literally half of the act was pulled back. And what it really did, if you look at the 2014 law, is it really gave time for property owners who had problem structures in problem properties. It gave them time to unload their problems to unsuspecting buyers. This has been going on since 2014. So now the 2012 Act is kicking back in, and the 2014 Act is going away. And anybody who's bought properties, other people's problems, after 2014, thinking they were buying a really good deal, they're now going to see their premiums shooting up really severely. Okay, so it's kind of a mess in that respect, but I wanted to cover all that because it's important for you to understand when your property owners come to you and they're trying to sell and they don't understand why they have this issue with flood insurance. Okay, so it's important for you to understand all that. All right, so let me see. The Biggert Waters Act, I'm just going to kind of cruise through this just for a second. This act basically affects all of these professions, okay? And it really, really has driven premiums up severely. Probably one of the biggest things that new law did was it increases fines to lenders if they don't force flood insurance. So anybody who's been in this profession for any length of time and they've never seen a whole lot of flood insurance being forced, they're going to see it now like never before because your lenders are running scared. Okay, I'm going to skip over that slide, but this one, the Biggert Waters Act, if you go in and you actually Google Biggert Waters, you're going to see that there's all this information in there, and it's all put in by the federal government. And remember now, the federal government is very self-serving. They end up telling you only what they want you to know. Okay, so so if I was to produce this document, and this was on one of their websites, and I thought, oh wow, this is a great tool, great information sheet for realtors. I printed it and I read over it and realized nowhere on this document does it talk about getting out of a flood zone. Okay, it only talks about paying flood insurance. So again, very self-serving. The point I'm making is plan A is get your guy out of a flood zone. Plan B would be, if I can't get you out of a flood zone, let's see if we can get the premiums down to where it's palatable, where your buyer's not going to walk away from the deal, where your seller doesn't have trouble selling this house, because even though I can't get it out of a flood zone, maybe I can get those premiums way down. So again, in the next 2 sessions, that's what we're going to talk about, is how to get you out of a flood zone. And if we can't get you out of a flood zone, how do we specifically get those premiums down? So, and that would all be with these couple documents that we talk about. Okay, so let me just cover one more thing. The Biggert Waters Act, probably one of the main things is it's going to eliminate all the grandfathering. It hasn't done that yet. So right now, if you've got older homes out there that are in flood zones and I can't get them out, the bad news is when this Biggert Waters Act, the last part of it's going to kick in anytime now. When it does, it's going to eliminate all grandfathering. It's going to eliminate all subsidies. In fact, a certain portion of that's already kicked in. All right. So if you've got a seller who is only paying $600 a year for flood insurance, your buyer is going to be caught off guard when they get into that 11th hour and they're about to buy the house. When they go to get a quote for flood insurance, quotes are no longer going to be $600. They're going to be at least $2,000, maybe $3,000 4,000, some of them as much as 6 and 8,000. That's what we're seeing. Okay. So there's a lot of things that affect that price for flood insurance, but it's important for you to understand that just because the seller is only paying a small amount, your buyer is going to get hit with a much higher amount right now. All the more reason for us to be proactive and try and take care of this problem before it gets too far along. And of course, I did already mention that those fines are increasing to lenders if they don't force flood insurance. So many of our properties here in Michigan are on water or near water. So we do have an issue, and you're going to see it more and more. Okay. If we talk about when properties are sold and the order in which FEMA wants things to happen, this would be the order. It's important to note that the lender is supposed to give your buyer a 10-day notice. That's a federal law. They have to give you 10-day notice prior to the closing that your buyer is going to be forced to place flood insurance. Okay, so you have to buy flood insurance a year in advance. So if your buyer is going to have to buy that house and we can't get it out of a flood zone, they're going to have to place the flood insurance prior to the closing, and they're going to have to pay a lump sum for that insurance up front. You always have to pay flood insurance a full year in advance, okay? And then what they're going to do is they're going to prorate the flood insurance. They're going to actually escrow it. Every house payment every single month will be increased. So if your buyer is paying $2,400 a year, after they buy the insurance for $2,400 a year, their house payment is going to increase by $200 a month. It prices people right out of houses, okay? And that's a small amount. If it really is only $2,400 a year, someone's getting lucky there, okay? Very often it's much more than that. So let's talk a little bit about flood zones, okay? When we talk about flood zones, anytime you go to school, whether it's high school, college, or whatever, night school, if you get an A is always considered a good thing. When we talk flood zones, A's are always a bad thing, okay? So anytime you see a classification for a flood zone with the letter A on it, that means we got a problem, okay? Somebody's going to be forced to pay flood insurance. Now, it can be A all by itself, or it could be A coupled with something else, okay? But either way, it's going to be tough because we're going to have to do something with respect to the flood zone, okay? And just real quick, I threw this slide in here just so you know that all of those terms are all interchangeable. They all mean the same thing, okay? In any given year, you could have a 1% chance of flooding. That is what a 100-year flood zone is. They say once in every 100 years it's going to flood, or in any given year you have a 1% chance of flooding, okay? They also call it the base flood zone or the special flood zone hazard area, but they are all interchangeable terms, okay? Now, the most common flood zones are A coupled with something, and that's a studied area. And those, for the most part, if we've got a flood zone with an A and something else with it, most of the time I can get you out really quick, okay? And by that I mean we get out there, we check it, usually within a week. A lot of times people say, well, how much do you charge to check it? We usually charge $200 to go check a structure, okay? And so your client would gamble with $200 to start with. At that point, we're usually saying, yes, we're 100% sure we can get them out or not, okay? And that's with the A coupled with something else. If it's A all by itself, it's called a non-studied area. That's a problem. You know why? Because I haven't been given a number. I don't know what the elevation that the water is truly going to come up to, okay? A non-studied area, FEMA's really slick. They came in and blanketed the whole area, calls it a flood zone, but then they tell us, oh, but we're not going to tell you what that elevation is for the water. So that's trickier. Many surveyors have trouble with that, and we have a kind of a system on how we figure that out for you. Velocity zones are coming to Michigan. I mention this because we've never had a velocity zone in Michigan. It's always been on the oceans. Starting in June, our Great Lakes are now having velocity zones. The first one that's getting it is going to be Lake Erie. What is it going to do? It's going to raise our flood zones even higher. So if you know of anybody buying properties or building houses along our Great Lakes, we need to caution them that flood zones could be raising up as much as 6 feet in the next couple months to a year. Okay, so we need to build extra high if we're anywhere near the Great Lakes because of these new flood zones. And then there's this thing called X shaded and X unshaded. And it's important to understand that those are kind of our safe zones. I live in an X unshaded, and I live up on a hill. And so only once every 100 years will my property flood where my house is. Okay. And I'm going to skip over that. Now, usually in this point, I would ask everybody in the room, I would ask, who knows what a floodway is? And most of the time, everybody would say, none of us know what a floodway is. So that being said, it's important to understand that a floodway is actually an area along a river, creek, stream, drain where the water is flowing, and from the thread of that river outward, when it floods, the water will spill over the banks. It'll inundate the ground around houses and structures, and somewhere from the thread outward is this area of moving water. All right, so that area of moving water is considered a very high hazard area. All right, and the water has to be flowing and moving because we need the water of the flood to subside. So there is this area, it's a calculated area from the center outward, which is an extremely high hazard area. You do not want your people buying houses in floodways. Now, the thing I need to caution you about is nobody tells anybody about properties in floodways. Many times people will say, get an elevation certificate. At no time does anyone tell you or your client, there's not even a box to check on an elevation certificate, that you're buying a structure in a floodway. High hazard, really scary area. Okay? We always think of a floodway as the highway for the moving water. So right now, if you look here, you see all of this is blue. This is a flood zone map. Anything in blue is going to be flood zone. Anything in this crosshatched area is going to be floodway. That's going to be moving water, very high hazard area. So normally if I was in a room with all of you and I could talk to you, I'd say, what if you were asked to sell that house right there? Do you think you'd have trouble selling it? And usually we would say, yes, I think we might have trouble selling that house. And then I would say, do you think we could ever get this house out of a flood zone? And most of the time, everybody in the room will say, no way, you can't get that out of a flood zone. You've got moving water hitting this structure, which is extremely dangerous. It can uproot the structure, shove it downstream. Okay, so you would say probably no, and I would say you're wrong. And we can get this structure out of a flood zone as long as I had one just like this in downtown Lansing. And for 6 years, they could not sell this house. And they finally contacted me. They said, is there anything you can do for us? And at that point, we went out, we checked it. It was on the side of a cliff overlooking the river. We checked the lowest point where the ground met the structure, and we found that elevation at the lowest point where that ground met the structure was 6 feet above the flood zone. So the flood map was wrong. In fact, it was so wrong that it was not only was it in a flood, not in a flood zone, but it wasn't in a floodway. There was not going to be any moving water hitting the structure. So this house did qualify to be removed from a flood zone. Again, this is really important that you understand that just because it shows it's in a flood zone and a floodway, it doesn't mean it's a lost cause. Okay. We're right up against the 6:30 mark, or 12:30 mark, I'm sorry. And so I think I'm almost at the end and I'm coming up on it. I kind of told you a floodway story just now. And so that is probably most of what we wanted to cover today. It's real important that when you come back next Tuesday, we are going to talk about how to make buildings go from non-compliant to compliant. We're going to talk a little more about the elevation certificates, and we are going to talk about new construction in flood zones as well. So that being said, I think we're done here. Is anybody there for me to talk to? Any questions?
I think that we have one question here, Carol, and I
Okay.
think that it's from the beginning of your presentation when you were talking about raising a house up.
Okay.
Someone is asking what you filled the ground with, soil or sand?
That's a really good question. If we're going to raise ground anywhere in or near a flood zone, we always want to use clay. We want to have, it should be clay that is going to have a 95% compaction. And we're really required to place, they call it engineered soil, which is clay. So we kind of want someone to come in and do some testing. So we normally have somebody come in and do some compaction testing to make sure that we've achieved our 95% compaction. That way, if the water ever did come up, if it was sand, the waters would just wash the sand away, and you would not be building your house on a good foundation. Okay. Any
Thank
other
you.
questions?
Yep, we have another one. How long are lomas good for?
That's a great question. So all the lomas, in the very end, I'm going to show you how to look lomas up, and we'll show you how to turn them on a map, and you'll be able to look up your properties, and you'll be able to see how many lomas around you, or if your own property has already received a loma. And you'll also see the date that the most current map was done in. Okay, and it'll be right there on this map that we show you. And so the effective map will be, let's say, 2012. And so any lomas that were done prior to the 2012 date, which is the effective map, they would now be null and void. Okay. Any lomas that are done after the effective date would be considered valid lomas. All right. So every time we come out with a new map, which is usually every 20 years or so, all the previous lomas that were generated were all now null and void. Now, what can you do? Your people can actually request to revalidate a LOMA, and all they would have to do is call our office, and we can tell them how to revalidate LOMAs for free. Okay. Any other questions?
That is all of the questions that we have for now. Thank you so much for your time and information today, Carol. And we will be back next week on Tuesday and Thursday at noon for our digital roundtables to finish up this session. Thank you, everybody, and have a great weekend.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye now.